Hey everyone, welcome to another video. We've just concluded our coverage of the bishop e3 Mar Plata, and now we'll look at the more topical, putting the bishop on d2 instead. You see that the bishop is on a good diagonal on the long g1 to a7 diagonal, but the problem is that white loses a lot of time because we'll play f5, f4 with tempo. Our pawn storm is coming very quickly. It proves extremely dangerous, and almost everyone has now decided that that is just too tough to handle. So instead, white develops bishop to d2. Now we're going to see quite similar themes. Our play remains the same on the king side, but the question is whether it's worth a tempo to put the bishop on the active f2 square rather than d2. Bishop tends to be quite passive on d2, but there's one try that white's been attempting that's quite critical. Let's put the bishop from d2 to a5 to target our pawn on c7 and try and provoke some weaknesses. That's what we'll check out in this video. So we have the typical classical King's Indian moves, the Mar del Plata, continuing our coverage of knight e1, which is the main move here. We drop back to get ready for f5, knight d3. This time the knight jumps into d3 immediately. Last we saw bishop e3, but our plan remains the same. We play f5, and there's some subtleties here with white's move order that we don't need to worry about too much, but I'll mention briefly. Here the main move is to go bishop d2. Bishop e3 might be possible, but after knight f6, white is not going to do anything better than f3, when f4 will transpose back into the lines we've covered already. White can also start with f3, which we'll examine later. Now, I recommend to play the normal kind of move here of knight f6, targeting the pawn on e4. This is the most aggressive choice. It is possible to take on e4 immediately, but I'm not suggesting this for two reasons. First of all, the positions after fe4, knight e4, knight f5 are a bit dull. I think black is doing okay because we have the d4 outpost, whereas white's got the one on e4. I think that's strategically balanced, but it's not very exciting, and we want the double-edged fight on the king side if we can get it. Secondly, if white starts with f3, then we don't have this option of taking on e4. Taking on e4 there only works because white is obliged to take with the knight, and we're in time to activate our pieces. Therefore, let's just be consistent and play knight f6. One final thing to say at this point is, in general, don't play f4 before white's committed to f3. If we play f4 immediately, there's two problems. First of all, if we actually get in g5, g4, we're not attacking anything yet. So white's got an extra important tempo to keep his kingside solid. Secondly, and more importantly, we allow that bishop to activate from e2 to g4. I've tried to reiterate over and over again the importance of our light square bishop in all of these Mar del Plata variations. We need it to be able to sacrifice, open up white's king if white tries blockading everything with f3 and h3. Therefore, our bishop is far better than white's on e2, so do not let it out to g4. Therefore, start with knight f6. The pawn is attacked on e4. Now white has played f3 to defend the pawn. Now it's time to close it. Bishop is bad on e2. We don't need to worry about it being activated. So our plan remains the same. We're going to play on the king side with a kingside pawn storm, g5, h5, g4, etc., while keeping in mind that white might still try rook c1, c5, and knight b5. So we have to cover the c7 square with rook f7 to make sure that knight doesn't hop in and cause some mischief. c5 is the most logical move. White could also start with rook c1, but it's likely to come to the same thing. We'll still play g5, and we have the same position here. So c5. So white is a tempo up on what we've just been examining in depth with the bishop over on f2, but the bishop on d2 doesn't put as much pressure on our position. The pawn a7 is now completely safe. There's no issues of bishop f2, knight b5 taking on a7. So we don't need to worry about that. And the bishop in general doesn't fulfill much of the role on d2. White can say that at least if we get pawn to g3, we're not attacking the bishop, but we're still going to have some big threats, and White's going to have to deal with it. But White is a tempo up on his queenside attack, and he can try and use this bishop on d2 to come to a5 to attack the weak point in our position, the pawn on c7. This has become White's main and most topical try here, and is what we should look at very carefully. On this subject, White should keep c-pawns on the board for as long as possible to be able to put pressure on the pawn on c7. Once he exchanges on d6, which is very common, we're very, very comfortable because White lacks any play, as we'll see. After that, okay, our moves remain the same. We're going g5. We're going to go knight g6 so that we can play rook f7 to cover the 7th rank against most moves. If White exchanges and plays rook c1, we're just going to come to the same thing with knight g6. He could try knight f2 to immediately try and control this g4 square. Here, White's not anywhere near threatening a knight into c7. It's already rook c1, knight b5, knight c7. It's going to take 3 tempi. So rook f7, knight g6 is only 2. So we can start defending against that whenever White starts attacking it, if that makes sense. So we can just get on with it on the king side with h5 for now. h3. White doesn't need to play h3 immediately, but in general, this is his defensive idea in this line. I think I was already quite vocal in how I don't trust this kind of setup for White at all in general. This one, in some ways, is a better version because we can't play g4 and force him to take with a pawn at the moment. He can take with the f pawn and then the knight and then the bishop because he's already got the knight to f2. So it's a better defensive setup, a defensive shield than normal. But his queenside play is so slow here. I mean, it's non-existent. We've got all the time in the world to build up our attack. I go knight g6. Point out that I think people will stop playing this way as White very soon, because even the engines now with like this new Stockfish Ne1 loves black here. It appreciates that g4 is coming when White's king is going to be just a sitting duck there on g1. And there's not a lot White can do in the meantime. But this is an old main line, so we should pay some care to it. White has a few ways to do something over on the queen side. For example, a4. Let's play rook f7. Here, there's not so much that we're defending the c7 square, although it's useful. But mainly we're getting ready to move the bishop from g7 either to f8 or h6, and then swing the rook across to g7 to put more pressure on White's king. And then we're ready for g4. The choice of where to put this bishop from g7 is sometimes tricky. h6 is useful if, when we go g4, White is going to be obliged to play f takes g4. And then we've got a good bishop active on h6, threatening to come into e3, especially in the lines where the bishop is on f2, or at least not on this diagonal. On d2, it's not quite as clear, but still, if White is going fg, in general, we want the bishop on h6. We might go to g5 as well. That's a more active square. However, f8 is more useful in controlling our potentially weak pawn on d6. Have to keep an eye on this backward pawn that can't be defended by any other pawns. And so if White is going to attack that pawn first, then it's useful to come back to f8 to give the pawn some protection. So it's difficult sometimes to know which one to go for, but though that is the two dynamics that are playing off against each other. So knight b5, White is potentially attacking the pawn on d6 at least. It's defended adequately here, but therefore it makes more sense to go to f8 to give the pawn a bit of protection. And here White has a few moves. But our plan is going to be to break with g4, either immediately as a pawn sacrifice or rook g7 first and then g4. We're attacking White's king, as always. For example, a5, we can immediately march on with g4. After the pawns get exchanged, here you can see White can't take twice with the major pieces because the pawn on e4 is going to be hanging. So he has to take with a pawn at some point. In fact, if he starts with taking with a bishop, we can even increase the pressure with rook g7, which is even stronger. And with knight h4 coming next, white's got really unpleasant pressure down the g file. So he probably should take with the pawn, and then knight e8, getting our queen involved. This is another question where the knight should retreat to. Sometimes h7, sometimes e8. Here, again, e8 is helpful defending the d6 pawn and the c7 square, stopping that knight ever jumping in on b5. And h7, I think, is only beneficial when we're ready to sacrifice the knight on h3. You know, in those positions where white is trying to create a barrier, particularly if he's succeeding in exchange with light square bishops. But some position where he has the bishop on f1 and reacts to g3 with h3. There it's useful, then that can come to g5 to sacrifice itself on h3. With the kingside already open, the knight isn't needed on h7 and might as well fulfill a good defensive role on e8. Rook a3 is a traditional kind of defensive resource, trying to defend across the third rank. And bishop e7 was already quite a nice move. Activating this bishop is going to go to h4, play rook h7, and bishop g3 with a huge attack already. If we're given enough time to put the bishop on g3, it's game over with queen h4, basically. So white's already under a lot of pressure. The extra pawn here doesn't count at all. It's just a weak pawn on g4. And white's failed to get anywhere at all on the queen side. Probably rook c1 is the best try for white. Here, I wouldn't rush with g4 just because white has some slightly annoying knight c7 ideas supported by the rook when we try and jump in with our queen. So after some g4, remove the knight and queen g5. It's slightly unpleasant pressure down the c file with the rook there. So we'll just start with rook g7. g4 is still the aim, but we don't need to rush it. I can try defending along the third rank again. Here it's a good time to kick the knight when it's forced to a passive square. And bishop d7 is a useful developing move. What we should be aware of when we play a6 is we don't want to give white enough time to play knight c4, a5, and knight b6. He's got a nice outpost for that knight. Bishop d7 is playing against that because we're ready to play b5 should the knight come to c4, forcing that knight back again. In fact, right now, knight c4, b5 is just very, very good because the knight doesn't have a square to go to. So white should try a5, tactical resource. We can't take the pawn on a5 because rook c8 hits our queen and the rook on a8. But we can still prevent this knight jumping into b6 with b5. It's also tempting to just go on with it with g4. But b5 is a nice sort of didactic style move. We want to prevent knight c4 to b6. So it makes sense to play b5, even if concretely g4 is also good here. We've taken away white's outpost, and our queen is strong on this long diagonal. With the knight pinned, g4 is increasing in power, and white's just in trouble here. He should move his king out of the pin, but then we can just play rook c8, make sure white's not getting anywhere on the queen side before returning to g4. I could try a5 when we have a nice choice. We can go forward with the knight, getting ready for g4. We can go back, which is always kind of fun. Still with the idea of g4. The knight looks very bizarrely placed on h8. But the point is to come around to h6 when we'll put more pressure on g4, probably regain our pawn that way. We can also push immediately with g4, which I think should be a draw with perfect play. Here white can take this way. The pawn is hanging on e4, but white's getting some annoying checks of his own with some bishop d3 and knight h6 check and queen h5. It's a bit murky. So it's better just to get rid of this knight. Now it looks extremely dangerous. We've opened up the g file and white can't really defend the g2 pawn. But what he should do is force a perpetual with queen e6 check, king h8, queen h6 check. And then we can go rook f7 and back again. or we can just move the king again when white needs to keep giving checks. So white needs to distract us from the g2 pawn to force a draw. But clearly we're not encountering any problems here at all. And we could also have played a knight move if we wanted more than a draw, instead of the immediate g4. So queen c2, white is ready to play knight c7 to e6, but we can just plow on. We don't need to take a timeout here with knight e8. White needs to take it, clearly. And in this position, white needs to find an incredibly tough defense to hold on. He needs to find queen b3 to be able to defend along the third rank. I don't think anyone's going to find this over the board. Here, waiting with rook b8 is interesting. It's a very kind of subtle position. But if we take on g4, the idea is this rook c7, which I don't think anyone's going to find. Distracting our rook, and the tactics just about work for white to hold, at least survive, although we're still better after we just exchange knights on f2 here. However, after knight h4, queen b3, this plan of queen b3 and rook c7 is incredibly sophisticated, and you're not going to find that unless you've got a bit of computer assistance, and white is worse anyway. Queen d1 is more sensible to defend this pawn on g4, but we can play around it. Let's kick that knight back, and now knight h5 is very pretty. The knight is coming into g3, a mega square for the knight, and it can't be taken because here we're threatening both rook h2 check and queen g2 mate, and simply queen g3, queen h2 mate, or rook takes rook, queen takes mate. This knight h5 is a nice theme to remember. The pawn on g4 isn't actually as aggressive as it looks because the g file is so vulnerable. Hopping in with knight c7 first is the most natural move, but it's just too slow. We can ignore the rook. We're going for mate again. And here we've got a beautiful finish with knight h2. Simply opening up the g file for our rook to take on g2 next move. It's useful that we're attacking the rook too. If the knight is taken, we can take. Next, we'll play queen g5 with the same mating patterns we just saw. We'll be threatening rook h2 check, queen g2 mate, or just queen g3 to h2 mate. So the knight can't be taken. White could try taking the bishop. For now, he's rook and knight up, but after we exchange, take on f1. There's the rook back. We're going to take on f2 next move, which will be forking the two bishops. White needs to take the knight because knight g3 is mate. So we'll just end up material up. A pawn up, but with a very active rook and knight. We're also threatening some mating nets with knight f3 and rook h2 mate, or a back rank mate. And so white's position is completely hopeless. So that was probably white's best try of putting the rook on the c-file. Queen c2 is an old move, but this is so risky. We just plow on with g4. We don't need to sack the pawn, but it's just so tempting to do it here. White isn't able to take back with the pieces, or at least if he does, we'll just exchange them, opening up lines for our queen to join. He'll still have to take with the pawn eventually. Jump in with the knight. We're ready to just put more pressure down the g-file with the traditional rook g7, rook c1, rook g7, queen d1. The only way of holding on to this pawn on g4 for the time being, but we kick the knight back, and whichever way the knight goes, we've got the same theme we've already seen with knight h5. The knight can't be taken because rook takes g2, and queen g5 again is going to be game over. And knight c4, we hop in. With such fantastic knights, white's not going to survive over on the king side for long. White has also tried going to c2 immediately without a4, but we can still do the same thing. Rook f7, we want to stop this knight jumping into c7, remember. a4, then here we can even go to h6 because white's not attacking the pawn on d6 with any speed. And after rook fc1, we've got an unusual way of stopping knight b5 here, and that's pinning with rook c7. This theme doesn't crop up very often in the King's Indian, but it works extremely well here because white's misplaces queen somewhat. Next, we're ready to play g4, and white's not getting his counterplay. Knight b5. Rook fc1. And let's just play a6 here, stopping the knight jumping to b5. Without knight b5, white doesn't have any counterplay here. a4, bishop d7. White's not getting any further over here. And we're ready to play g4 and continue attacking on the king side. So rook c1 is the main line. Now white has the threat that we need to remember of cd, knight b5 and into c7. So knight g6, so we can react to that with rook f7. Now the critical test is the immediate knight b5, keeping c-pawns on the board, which is actually a piece sacrifice, but we shouldn't take it. If white exchanges first, we're extremely comfortable. White can go back with bishop e1, but it doesn't make any sense. This has been played surprisingly often, but if you count tempi with just a tempo up here over the main lines that we were covering, where the bishop went to e3 and then f2. There it got to f2 in 2 moves. Now it's gone via d2 to e1, f2, 3 moves. That's just a pure extra tempo. So you should plow on with knight b5. Clearly we don't allow knight c7. Now white could go back and curl up in his shell with knight f2 and h3, but it's not really in keeping with knight b5. We can just kick this knight back. We've got time to play b5 and just keep this knight completely out of the game on a3. White was hoping to have enough time to go knight c4 and then either bishop a5 or a4, a5 and use the b6 outpost, but here he's not getting anywhere. Now we can just go back to attacking on the king side. So queen c2, renewing the threat of knight in to c7. So we defend. It's worth pointing out that knight takes a7, while generally not move we're worried about anyway, because we can move the bishop, just lose the piece here because we've got queen b6 check. And we take the knight with the queen. Now we're ready to play a6 and b5 next, kicking that knight away, making sure it doesn't have a square. So a4 is quite usual. The point is, well, it prevents b5, and if we play a6, he's one tempo closer to going knight a3, a5, knight c4, and into b6. So I'll just leave it for now. Go back to our attack on the king side. And now we could play a couple of different moves. The main line is bishop f8. I don't want to give white the option of taking this pawn on a7. Now there's no queen b6 check, because the knight is blocking it. It would be a pure pawn sacrifice. It's really murky, but I don't see why we need to give white the option. So if we just move the bishop, there's no knight takes a7 now. And we can just continue normally. Our plan is simply to play bishop back now that there's no knight takes a7, and rook g7, and g4, the normal stuff. Once we play bishop f8 here, the knight is also going to be free on e8 once we've kicked white back to join the attack. Knight c7 only walks into a pin, rook c8, and we win material. The queen is hanging. I can try a5, but it's just very slow. We play our moves, bishop f8, rook g7. We're ready to start breaking on the king side. Kotoronius goes into a lot of detail here in his book series on the King's Indian, but I don't think we need so much detail. I think white's position is just already very ropey. It's unclear what he's doing on the queen side, and our attack is definitely coming on the king side as usual. I'll just show one sample variation. Queen b3, knight h4. The knight is useful there, but g4 is coming. We just need to time it correctly. Now we can hit the knight back, so our knight can also join the attack. If white doesn't play knight d3 here, we're ready to play g4 already by this point, with more than defending it. So the knight needs to move, so our knight is hanging, but now we've got a nice piece sacrifice with knight takes f3. G takes, bishop takes h3, and g4 is going to be just terrible, and bishop takes g4. Our pawns are crashing through. At bishop d1, we don't even need to take this pawn on e4. We can just increase the pressure with the rook h7. At the cost of a piece, white's king is just caught wide open, and he's not going to defend this. We can take on e4 next. We can go g3, get the swing our queen across. The idea of g3 is quite nice. If we go g3, queen e7, and rook h1 check, take, queen h7 check, queen h2 mate. It's just, it's impossible to defend this position for white. Queen b3, I thought, was at least the best try for white to make it not so straightforward for us. We can't simply play bishop f8 g4 on autopilot. We start with bishop f8. And here white generally doubles on the c file. The idea is to get this knight into c7 to create some counterplay. This was a reason for moving the queen to b3 in the first place. As we saw, white couldn't play knight c7 immediately because of rook c8 with an unpleasant pin, so he has to wait a lot of time to do it. White can take a timeout now to prevent g4, but it's all going to come to much the same thing. We still jump the knight in. Now we can force that knight back. It's good timing to play it now because white was about to threaten to play rook fc1 when we would no longer have time to hit the knight away because the knight would jump into c7. So as the threat, white is threatening to jump into c7, so let's kick the knight away. It goes back, and this has actually transposed to the immediate rook c2 rather than h3. You notice that our knight suddenly becomes liberated once we've hit the knight back, because we don't need to worry about any knight c7s, so our knight on e8 can rejoin the attack. So there's a few squares. c3 is a bit of an odd square, as the bishop on d2 is now blocked in. The point is to try and defend across the third rank. Let's force that knight back. Again, we don't want to allow white time to play rook c1 and knight c7. So it goes back. And now we can play b5, highlighting quite how clumsy white's pieces are with this rook on c3. We're not allowing white his plan. After he takes, we can pin with rook d8, followed by recapturing. And we can also just get on with it immediately. We didn't need to play b5. We could have got on with it immediately with g4. But once again, I like the idea of b5, just preventing white from carrying out his plan of sticking knight in on b6. So rook c3 is a bit clumsy, but rook c4 is even more so. It kind of just gets in the way of everything to my eye. But it was played by Kozul, who's a very strong grandmaster who is also a King's Indian specialist. So if he's playing on the other side of the board, we should pay attention. But still, I don't really trust it. So the issue is that white wants this square for his knight. So I don't see why you would have the rook on c4 rather than c2. We can, now the knight is blocked, pushed back. There's no knight c7s to worry about, so we can go forward, knight f6, ready to push g4. This pawn is always going to be poisoned on b7. We've just got discovered bishop moves, bishop b5, for instance, so we don't need to worry about it. So white doubles, and we can crash through. And here there's lots of tempting moves. We can play the normal knight h4, hitting the pawn on g4. That would be the most sort of thematic continuation. We can also play over on the queen side with b5, hitting this rook. It's on a bit of a weird square, stopping the knight coming to c4. But knight h5 is also very pretty. The knight is coming into g3. This fantastic outpost. We've seen this theme before. So the knight is taken. And at the cost of the piece, we've now opened up our rook down to g2, which is rather unpleasant to defend. The automatic bishop at f1, way to do it, fails. Rook takes g2, because after it's taken, queen g5, and white has no way of defending the bishop on g2, so it's completely lost. Therefore, he has to play g4, not the most natural move, en passant, and the knight has to jump into the corner. And now there's a couple of nice moves. We can play knight f3 check, which would actually transpose, but make it easier for white. Knight g2 is pretty. I'll come to the same thing, but white needs to play some very accurate moves to hold the draw here. If he takes the knight, queen h4, it's just game over. Queen h2 is a big threat. If knight takes g3, we can go queen h3 check and then queen f2 check and pick off the knight. So there's no defense here. So white needs to play around the knight with queen f3. And now we could also hop back with knight f4 with great compensation if we're playing for more than the draw. And we're fully in our rights to do so here. We've got a fantastic position. But we can also go queen h4. The most direct. Queen h2 is a huge threat, so the knight needs to be taken. Bishop comes out. And we have a draw as white needs to keep an eye on the h2 square. Of course, the pawn can't be taken on g3 because bishop takes e2 and he's walked into a pin on the g file. That line's a bit of a fantasy variation, but it's always fun to see the knight h5 sacrifice working to such good effect. It's a theme that's well worth remembering. The most natural square for the rook is clearly c2. Here it's not getting in the way of either of the bishops or taking away the c4 square from the white knight. Now rook fc1 and knight c7 is a threat, so it's time to kick the knight away, which normally drops back to a3 because it wants to come to c4 and b6. But now that a knight no longer is needed to cover the c7, we can activate it. White slows our g4 move, so we play the normal knight h4. And again, I like b5 just to stop white having this potential outpost with knight c4 into b6. White can't take the pawn here because we'll react with rook b8 with an unpleasant pin. And so it's not so clear how white is going any further on the queen side. And we're ready, of course, to play rook g7 and g4, or the immediate g4. Both are very strong. So as you can see, that going cd is a bit problematic for white. We can hold him off for long enough on the queen side that we're ready to break through with g4. Wesley So on the white side here played an interesting plan of king h1. This is subtle, but his idea is to go rook g1 and g3 and fight back on the king side. Here, and I would recommend to play h5. Nd3 chose bishop f8, but then Wesley reacted with g3. But I think h5 is more precise, so that after g3 we can fight immediately with g4. It's a completely crazy position here. Both kings are going to be somewhat vulnerable, and I think it should be about balanced. For example, white exchanges. Now if he takes with the bishop on f4, he's actually offering the exchange. After we swap, we have knight g4. We're threatening a big fork with the knight f2, as well as the knight hanging on f4 and queen h4. So white should give the exchange. And here we have a position where white's got a knight and 2 pawns for the rook. The knight is quite promising on a strong outpost on e6, but I think the game is likely to end in some perpetual because both white's and black's kings are somewhat vulnerable. It's difficult for white to increase the pressure here at least. Alternatively, he could take with a knight on f4. Now taking on g4 will come to the same thing, more or less. But white would prefer a knight on f4 jumping into e6. The bishop doesn't fulfill such a good role. He can drop back and keep the material. But here, our knight is a very strong piece on g4, blocking white's attack down the g-file and attacking ourselves. Next, when the bishop retreats, we'll probably go queen h6, just preventing any rook f1 ideas. And all our pieces are then very active. We've got time to go bishop d7 and rook f8, just increasing the pressure over there. It's us that's attacking on the king side again. But that's Wesley's interesting king h1 plan. Very rare, but it's worth remembering that sometimes white can try to attack over there as well. The main line is knight b5, or at least the critical line and topical line. The point of delaying exchanging on d6 is white wants to play bishop a5, attacking the pawn on c7 and forcing us to make a concession. We should play rook f7 anyway to defend this. Of course, white is threatening cd and knight c7. Never forget about that one. And a6 would allow c takes d6, sacrificing the knight for 2 big pawns. It's something that I don't want to allow. White increases the pressure. We have to defend the pawn. cd is now an unpleasant threat. And cd is a strong piece sacrifice, piece offering. Again, I'm not interested in grabbing a piece. White gets 2 advanced pawns, and he's taken away an important defensive pawn we have on d6, so his play comes quite easily. We're never going to be able to get round to attacking ourselves. So just recapture. In general, we want to be the ones sacrificing material in the King's Indian in general, but especially in the Plata variation, not accept some Greek gifts there. So the bishop needs to move now. And there are 2 logical moves. Going to b4, attacking the pawn d6, seems best, but actually the bishop gets in the way a bit on b4. Like white wants to play knight b4 to c6, and we can easily deal with the threat to the pawn on d6. So putting the bishop all the way back to e1 has proven to be the most challenging. But we'll first of all check bishop b4. I should note around here that this plan with putting the bishop on a5 is by far the most critical plan with developing bishop to d2. And therefore, any plans that combine putting the bishop on d2 and playing b4 are a bit illogical in my eyes, because that pawn on b4 gets in the way. You no longer have bishop a5 ideas, and you've taken away the b4 square from the knight, which is sometimes needed, so for example, to hop into c6 here. So we're very happy to face a combination of bishop d2 and b4. Here we defend the pawn. Now, white probably should be consistent and attack it again. If he switches back to trying to defend, we can just push him back. And here, the knight is just miserable. His pieces aren't coordinating here. He's not in time to play a4 to get that knight active. So his attack is completely ground to a halt. And then we just switch back to the king side very happily. So he attacks the pawn, and we defend it. But that's it. He can't attack it again. Tries a4. Point of a4, as usual, is just to prevent us going a6 and b5, keeping that knight dead out of the game on a3. We attack the rook. Now white probably doesn't have to move it immediately, but it's not clear what he's doing otherwise. But if he doesn't move it, I wouldn't be in a rush to take. In return for the exchange, white would have some light square control and a good advanced pawn on c6. Again, we don't really want to take material here. It's more that we're preventing white from taking on d6 ever, because we'll take the rook at that point and just making it difficult for white to make a good move. Moving the rook makes sense, at least to try and get a knight into c6, but the bishop is also now on the wrong square on b4. We can play h5, and we're just ready to start attacking with our normal g4. You don't need to memorize anymore, but one nice game continued with the thematic moves. And knight h8 is the reason I kept this game in. It's an idea that looks extremely odd, but the point is that you're trying to reroute this knight to f7 and then probably to h6 to get in g4. We open the g file for the rook, and we also put more pressure on the g4 pawn. After queen b3, bring the rook round. Bring the knight round. We can push that knight back. Now we can activate the other knight. Now that knight c7 is no longer a move, the typical theme. And so far, we're following a game between a Scottish international master, Graham Morrison, and English IM Richard Palliser, who's a good friend of mine and a fellow Chessable author. And so far, he's played an exemplary game. And at this point, there was no reason not to crash through with g4 when white's position is just crumbling. We're just far too fast on the king side. So you can see that attacking the pawn with bishop b4 doesn't really get anywhere. So it's better to go all the way back. White has wasted quite some time, but he's forced us to play b6, which is quite a big weakness, because now we don't no longer control the c6 square. So that's where white's counterplay is coming from. We can push forward immediately because the e4 pawn is undefended. There's another main line here of a6, which is this absolute chaos. So you can check this one out too if you want, but I think g4 is fine. And now the critical move is somewhat surprisingly to take it. The problem for white is that just trying to utilize the extra outpost he's created with knight b4 doesn't really get him anywhere. We can push the knight back. Now white can't play the other knight into c7 because the knight is pinning. The knight is in the way on c6, preventing the rook from c1 from getting involved. But the problem is if the knight goes back g3 and we've crashed through immediately. I just lost here, I think. Our attack is way too fast. You try queen a4 with these weird pins. And here, Cotronius recommends this crazy knight takes e4, which might be strong, but it's a complete mess, and I don't think it's necessary. Let's just play calmly with bishop b7. Here white has to play the unnatural knight ba7 to stay on the board. These knights are very odd on c6 and a7, but he needs to dominate our bishop on b7. If he goes back to c3, we can switch back to the thematic g3. And the problem for white is after h3, we've got bishop c8, and bishop h3 is coming with mate. There's no way that white can actually stop it here. Therefore, the point of having out an a7 is that we can't go bishop c8 because he can take it. But still, the knights are only fulfilling that role. We go g3, h3, and we can threaten rook takes a7 here because queen's undefended. And white might manage to hold this position, but he needs to play perfectly to do so. We've got a few plans. We can play the knight back to d7, control some squares. Idea of maybe exchanging these knights on b8 or jump into c5. Play the knight forward to h4 and look at sacrifices on g2. Bishop f8, rook f6 to h6. We've got a lot of ways of increasing the pressure. And now d7 also holds the pawn on b6 usefully. It's difficult to see how white is doing anything active of his own. He's just desperate to prevent our bishop from b7 rejoining the attack. So that's not very impressive. Queen c2 is another try. It's seen a bit in correspondence. Of course, the threat is to jump in with knight c7. Now, the tricky thing is that the automatic response here would be knight e8, but then white can take the pawn on g4 because they're no longer attacking the pawn on e4. So I don't think there's anything wrong with gf. And white's probably going to recapture with the bishop and then play knight e8 and just hold that way. But in correspondence, they've tried bishop b7, keeping the pawns on g4 and f3, keeps ideas of playing g3 later. The knight can hop in, but now after gf and rook c8, the knight looks very strong on e6, but we're going to expel it with exchange of knight f8. The knight disappears and we're comfortable. The queen can be hit, but it doesn't change very much. We just carefully play around this knight and then eventually force it off the board. So both taking on f3 and knight e8 or this slightly odd looking bishop b7 are both fine. But queen c2 is tricky. But the move that they've been trying in human chess is f takes g4. Now it's kind of strange that this has become the main line of the entire bishop d2, knight e1, bishop d2, Mar del Plata variation. But it's given up his e4 pawn. And if he gives us even one tempo to play knight back to g5, say in e4, we're doing fantastically. We've got two huge pawns in the center. We activate our bishop on g7, and white's structure is a mess. But he's relying on a bind on the light squares. For example, playing bishop f3. This was Markus Rager, the Austrian theoretician's first try, but it doesn't look very impressive to me. Knight g5, we're threatening to play e4. Knight f2 would be the other way to control the e4 square, but we can continue attacking with knight h4. And after knight c3, we can just grab this. And after it's taken, rook c7 was a nice suggestion by Vigorito, pinning the knight on c3 and just keeping flexible with our bishop. We'll probably go to b7 to put some pressure on this pawn on d5, not allow white to stick with knight e4 here. So we're about to exchange and play bishop b7, knight e7. The pawn is quite vulnerable. White can try knight b4, but queen d7 hits the pawn on g4 and shows an advantage of leaving the bishop on c8 for the time being. After h3 is just a bad move. White should sacrifice that pawn, but obviously it's not gone very well for white. But now this is just very bad because we're ready to play e4 next. The knight can't take it because of the pin, and the queen can't anymore because the rook is defending it. And once we get e4, we're just winning. White has to stop e4 from being playable. So knight b4, kind of bizarre looking move, but white's jumping in with knight c6. And the position is very sharp. And you're only going to get this position against a highly prepared opponent. But still, we should pay special attention. Now there are two moves. a6 is the main one, but I'll offer an alternative with a5. This is kind of counterintuitive. We force the knight into the outpost on c6. But the point is that the knight is now trapped on c6. It can't run away. And so we're ready to exchange off a pair of knights. Get rid of his big piece. After bishop d3, knight back. Bishop f5. We're obliged to give the exchange here because we've got no square for our queen. If we go back to e8 or b7, knight takes c6 is happening. So we take, and then we get rid of these knights. We're threatening the pawn on f5. So the only defense is queen h5. Instead, g4 to try and defend it. a4 is very good for us. White doesn't have a good reply now to bishop a6. This was a reason for playing a4 to stop a4 by white. If the knight is forced back, then our domination of the light squares is just fantastic here. White's got no time at all to set up this bind on the e4 square. And so eventually we'll play e4 and both our bishops will be involved. So it needs to go queen h5. Now it's bishop a6, a4. Taking this pawn encounters some problems on the c7 square. But we can just play rook f8. The a pawn remains weak. Pawn on f5 is weak. I have no idea objectively the evaluation. In the correspondence game we were following from last year, black held extremely comfortably. And I think I would much prefer to be on the black side of this position. White's got a lot of weaknesses. All these light squared pawns, f5, d5, and a4 are all weak. We've got a good knight on c5. We've got the central pawns f4 and e5, ready to go e4 at some point, activating the bishop on g7. All looks good to me. Small price to pay, the exchange. So this is a very interesting alternative line. It's up to you whether to play it or the main move of a6, hitting the knight. And white needs to find this bishop f3. Knight back to a3 is just too far away from the e4 square. Knight c3, we can take it and push with e4. It's game over for white if we're allowed to play e4 and f4. Therefore, we need to play bishop f3 first, so that AB bishop takes e4. And if we move the knight, he can drop the knight back to c3 with some control of the e4 square. Now, Hikaru Nakamura played knight g3, which was highly praised, but I don't really trust it. It's a very, very murky position. Instead, I'd prefer to come back to g5. Knight e4 is a big threat, of course. Knight's coming to c3. White throws in knight c6. It doesn't matter whether he does it immediately or later. Position remains the same. I'll get this complicated position. The point of bishop f6, by the way, is white was threatening to play h4, hitting our knight. Now he can't play h4 because we'll take on f3 and take on h4. So first bishop f6, stopping that. Knight e4 and king h8. With a strategically, dynamically balanced, can we say, position. Our plan is going to be to complete development and play h5 after rook g7 probably, and put pressure down the g file. White is hoping that his bind on the light squares will be sufficient. But I think it's still difficult for him to maintain control. We have plans to doubling, activating this rook. Maybe we'll go even queen g7 rather than rook g7, bishop d7, and then rook f8 or rook g8. Try and force through f3 if white moves that bishop away. and also ideas of e4 if he releases the bind at all. This line is very sharp, and the reason I've given two choices, a6 or a5, but this is probably the critical line in the entire 9 knight e1 the Plata variation, and so it's the main line you need to check as well as the bayonet in the entire King's Indian. But I hope that the suggestions I've given are promising and that you will enjoy playing them. Thanks a lot for following, and see you again soon.